Inside Marion State Prison, Illinois. There are prisons, and then there are places designed to break something deeper than the body. Behind these walls in southern Illinois, men were locked away not just from society, but from each other. No conversations. No movement. No escape from silence. For years, this prison became a living experiment, one that would change incarceration in America forever. Because inside Marion, control wasn't just enforced, it was absolute. And what happened here didn't stay here. Marion Federal Penitentiary was never meant to become the most restrictive prison in the United States. But violence changed everything. And what followed created a system so extreme, it would later be copied across the country. Before we go deeper, take a moment to subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Because understanding this story means stepping inside a place where time slows down, and silence becomes a weapon. Alcatraz is gone. But the problem remains. When Alcatraz closed in 1963, it left behind a problem the federal government couldn't ignore. Where do you send the most dangerous inmates in the country? Not just violent criminals, but escape artists, organized crime leaders, and individuals who couldn't be controlled in standard prisons. The answer was Marion. Built in rural Illinois, far from major cities, Marion Federal Penitentiary was designed to replace Alcatraz, but with a more modern approach. At first, it worked. The prison operated like a traditional high-security facility. Inmates moved in groups. They worked jobs. There were structured routines, supervised recreation, and limited, but real, human interaction. On the surface, it looked controlled. But beneath that structure, something else was growing. Because Marion didn't just house dangerous individuals. It concentrated them. And when you bring together men with influence, violence, and nothing left to lose, power doesn't disappear. It reorganizes. Inside the prison, informal hierarchies began to form. Groups aligned by race, ideology, and survival. And slowly, the balance between control and chaos began to shift. At first, it was small incidents. Fights in the yard. Tensions in the dining hall. Then it escalated. Weapons were being made from scraps. Conflicts became coordinated. And officers began to realize something unsettling: this wasn't random violence anymore. It was organized. And what happens when a prison loses control, even slightly? What comes next is rarely contained. When control collapses. By the late 1970s, Marion was changing. Not in policy, but in atmosphere. Officers felt it first. The tension. The unpredictability. The sense that the prison was no longer fully under their control. Inmates were testing boundaries, sometimes subtly, sometimes violently. And the system struggled to respond fast enough. Because traditional prison structures depend on one key element: movement. Controlled movement, yes, but movement nonetheless. Inmates go to the yard. They work. They eat together. But movement creates opportunity. Opportunity for communication. Opportunity for planning. Opportunity for violence. And inside Marion, those opportunities were being used. Then came October 1983. 2 correctional officers were killed in separate incidents. Not during riots. Not during chaos. But during routine operations. The kind of routine that's supposed to be predictable. Safe. Controlled. The attacks were precise. Intentional. And they sent a message through the entire prison system: Marion was no longer manageable under normal conditions. For the administration, the conclusion was immediate. Something had to change. Not gradually. Not experimentally. Completely. What they decided to do next would redefine incarceration in America. The lockdown that never ended. After the murders, Marion entered a full lockdown. At first, it was meant to be temporary. A response to restore order. But days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And then something unprecedented happened. The lockdown stayed. Indefinitely. Inmates were confined to their cells for approximately 23 hours a day. Movement stopped. Group interaction ended. Even basic routines were stripped down to the minimum. Meals were delivered through slots in steel doors. Recreation, when allowed, was done alone, inside small, enclosed spaces. There were no shared yards. No communal activities. No real human contact. This wasn't discipline. This was a new model. A prison within a prison. And for the first time in U.S. history, a facility operated under permanent lockdown conditions. The goal was simple: eliminate opportunity. No movement meant no coordination. No coordination meant no organized violence. On paper, it made sense. And in some ways, it worked. Violence dropped. Control was restored. But something else began to emerge. Something less visible, but far more complex. Because when you remove nearly all human interaction, you don't just control behavior. You change the human mind. The cell becomes your world. Inside Marion, the cell isn't just a room. It's existence. A typical day begins and ends in the same place. The same walls. The same sounds. Or more accurately, the same silence. Morning arrives not with sunlight, but with routine. A tray slides through the slot. Minimal interaction. No conversation beyond basic commands. Time becomes difficult to track. Without movement, without variation, days blur together. Inmates develop their own rhythms. Some pace constantly, back and forth, counting steps. Others sit still for hours, conserving energy, or trying to hold on to focus. Reading becomes an escape. If books are available. Writing letters becomes a lifeline. If there's someone to write to. But for many, there is nothing. Just time. And thoughts. And when thoughts are the only thing you have, they don't always stay under control. Some inmates begin talking to themselves. Others create routines so rigid they become rituals, anything to impose structure on an environment that has none. And over time, the question stops being how to pass the day, and becomes something else entirely. How do you hold on to yourself, when everything around you is designed to strip you down? The mind under pressure. Isolation doesn't just affect behavior. It affects perception. In environments like Marion, inmates report changes that are difficult to explain, unless you've experienced them. Sounds become amplified. Small noises feel intrusive. Silence feels heavy. Time stretches. Minutes feel like hours. And hours feel endless. Some begin to lose the ability to concentrate. Reading a page becomes difficult. Following a thought becomes exhausting. Others experience anxiety that builds without a clear cause. Paranoia. Irritability. And in more severe cases? Hallucinations. Seeing movement where there is none. Hearing voices where there is silence. These aren't rare occurrences. They're documented effects of prolonged isolation. And yet, the system continues. Because from a security standpoint, it works. But at what cost? That question has followed Marion for decades. And it's one that still doesn't have a clear answer. Control versus humanity. Marion became a blueprint. Its lockdown model was studied and replicated. Most notably in facilities like ADX Florence. Supermax prisons designed for total control. Minimal contact. Maximum restriction. Supporters argue that these environments are necessary. That some individuals are too dangerous for standard prisons. That safety, for staff and other inmates, must come first. And in many cases, that argument holds weight. But critics see it differently. They argue that prolonged isolation isn't just punishment. It's damage. Psychological damage that doesn't end when the sentence does. Because eventually, some inmates leave. They return to society, carrying the effects of years spent in near total isolation. So the question becomes unavoidable: is the system solving a problem? Or creating a new one? Marion Federal Penitentiary changed the way prisons operate. It proved that total control was possible. That violence could be reduced through isolation. But it also revealed something deeper. That control comes with consequences. And those consequences don't always stay behind prison walls. Because when you take a human being, remove connection, remove movement, remove time itself, you don't just contain them. You transform them. And the question that remains is simple. When the door finally opens, what walks out? The system inside the system. Even in isolation, systems begin to form. At Marion, communication never truly disappeared. It adapted. Inmates developed methods that required no direct contact. Tapping on walls. Whispering through vents. Passing coded messages during the briefest moments when doors opened. What sounds like random noise, often isn't. It's language. And over time, that language becomes structure. Certain inmates gain influence, not through physical dominance, but through reputation. Through connections that extend beyond the prison walls. Orders can still be given. Conflicts can still be managed. And loyalty still matters. Even when no one can stand face to face. This creates something unusual. A prison where isolation is absolute on the surface. But beneath it, networks continue to exist. Quietly. Carefully. And sometimes, dangerously. Because when authority believes control is total, that's often when control is being tested the most. The economy of confinement. Even in lockdown, value exists. And where there is value, there is economy. At Marion, the official system is simple. Limited commissary access. Basic necessities. Strict control. But unofficially, a different system operates. Items become currency. Food. Hygiene products. Stamps. Even information. A single envelope can carry weight. A small favor can create obligation. And debts, no matter how small, are taken seriously. Because in an environment where freedom is non-existent, control over even the smallest thing becomes power. And power, in a place like this, is everything. But what happens when debts aren't paid? When agreements are broken? In a prison built on isolation, consequences don't disappear. They just become harder to see. When silence turns into tension. There's a common assumption about places like Marion. That silence means peace. But silence can also mean pressure. Because tension doesn't need noise to exist. Inside lockdown units, conflicts don't erupt the way they do in traditional prisons. There are no large fights in the yard. No sudden outbreaks in crowded spaces. Instead, tension builds slowly, quietly, over days, weeks, months. A misunderstanding. A rumor passed through walls. A perceived disrespect. And without direct resolution, those tensions linger. They grow. And when an opportunity finally presents itself, even if it's rare, the outcome can be sudden and severe. Because in an environment of constant restraint, release doesn't happen gradually. It happens all at once. The officer's reality. For correctional officers, Marion isn't just a workplace. It's a constant calculation. Every movement is controlled. Every interaction is planned. Even something as simple as opening a cell door requires coordination, timing, backup. Because the risk is never zero, officers operate within strict protocols, not just for order, but for survival. And over time, the job changes them too. The silence, the repetition, the constant awareness. It creates a kind of mental strain that isn't always visible. Because unlike other environments, there are no breaks from the atmosphere. No casual conversations to reset the mind. Just routine, control, and the understanding that one mistake could change everything. The men who lived it. For inmates, time inside Marion isn't measured the way it is outside. It isn't weeks or months. It's endurance. Some men spent years in near-total isolation, learning to function in a space where nothing changes, where the environment is designed to remain the same every single day. And over time, adaptation becomes necessary. Some find structure, reading, writing, exercise. Others withdraw, reducing movement, limiting thought, doing whatever it takes to make time pass, without breaking under it. But not everyone succeeds. Because the reality is simple. This environment demands something from you. And not everyone can give it. Which leads to a difficult question: is survival inside Marion about strength? Or about what you're willing to become? The aftermath of isolation. Eventually, some inmates leave Marion's lockdown. Transferred. Released. Moved into less restrictive environments. But the transition isn't simple. After years without normal interaction, basic communication can feel unfamiliar. Eye contact. Conversation. Even shared space. Things most people don't think about become overwhelming. Some struggle to adjust. Others never fully do. Because isolation doesn't just end when the door opens. It stays. In habits. In thought patterns. In the way a person sees the world. And that raises a question that extends beyond Marion itself. What is the long-term cost of total control? Not just for the individual, but for society as a whole. The blueprint that spread. Marion didn't remain unique. Its model spread. Supermax prisons were built using the same principles. Isolation. Control. Minimal contact. Facilities designed not just to hold inmates, but to manage the most extreme cases. And in many ways, Marion proved that such a system could work. Violence decreased. Order increased. But the debate never ended. Because effectiveness and impact are not the same thing. And what works in the short term may carry consequences in the long term. Marion Federal Penitentiary is more than a prison. It's a turning point. A place where the system chose control above all else. And in doing so, created a new standard for dealing with the most dangerous individuals in custody. But the story of Marion isn't just about security. It's about limits. The limits of isolation. The limits of control. And the limits of what the human mind can endure. Because behind every steel door, there is still a person. And when that door stays closed long enough, the question is no longer how to contain them. It becomes something deeper. What are we turning them into? And once that change happens, can it ever be undone? What happens inside places like Marion is rarely seen, but its impact reaches far beyond those walls. If this story made you think, take a moment to share your perspective below, and let me know where you're watching from. Subscribe for more deep, real stories like this. Because some truths don't live in headlines. They live behind locked doors.